Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone, and glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. If you find yourself shouting at your kids, as I do, several times a week, stop looking at your phone and talk to me, or unplug from your video game already, you have homework to do. This webinar is definitely for you. The fact is that technology gets in the way of all kinds of things, study habits, relationships with friends and family, and frankly, the rest of life. There are lots of good reasons why kids with ADHD shouldn't spend all of their time texting or watching YouTube. But the question is, how can parents successfully limit their child's screen time? Today, we have expert David Anderson to help us with this topic. He'll talk about the latest research on screen time and its effects, positive and negative, on the ADHD brain. He'll also give us guidelines on healthy screen limits. Let me introduce Dr. Anderson. He is Senior Director of the ADHD and Behavior Disorders Center and the Senior Director of National Programs and Outreach at the Child Mind Institute. He specializes in evaluating and treating children and adolescents with ADHD, behavior, anxiety, and mood disorders. He frequently lectures and leads workshops for policymakers, parents, and educators on key central mental health issues. Before Dr. Anderson makes his presentation, though, we'd like to conduct a little poll. What screen-related issue are you most concerned about? The kind of content your child looks at online, effects of social media or video games, the time spent on devices, or all of the above. While you're taking the poll, I'd like to say that the sponsor of this week's Attitude webinar is Play Attention, which enhances brain health and performance. Play Attention is the leading neurocognitive training program designed to strengthen executive function and self-regulation. The comprehensive Play Attention system includes NASA-inspired technology, cognitive training, behavior shaping, parent coaching, and much more. Call 800-788-6786 for their free ebooks on mindfulness, executive function, and more. Or go to their website, www.playattention.com. Now let's take a look at the poll results. Well, as suspected, all of the above. But time spent on devices, not so much content your child looks at online. I was a little surprised about that. But all of the above makes sense, I think. So now let me turn it over to Dr. Anderson. And thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Wayne. All right, so folks, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about the next 42 minutes going through the following stages. I'm going to first start with research on links between mental health and screen use. Then I'm going to do a few slides on the interaction between ADHD and screen use. And then what I'm going to try to kind of finish up with is practical guidelines for managing ADHD symptoms, in a world where digital technology is not really leaving us. It's not going to get reversed. It's only likely going to increase in terms of its reach and influence. As you have questions or as things come up as I'm presenting each of these three phases, please feel free to submit those questions. And then between 1:45 and 2, at least Eastern time, Wayne is going to then be feeding me those questions so that I can answer those inquiries, try to give some practical examples, and make sure that you leave here with some concrete action steps that you can take. Okay, so starting off, there is a lot about that is kind of spoken about in the media related to screens and mental health. I myself have done a number of different appearances on, say, Good Morning America, or on in other kind of print media related to things like gaming disorder, video games, the influence of social media in general, how to screen teens for difficulties with screen-related behaviors. And this is something that we as mental health professionals are talking with parents about a lot, because even though the disorders that we diagnose as professionals do not have screen-related behaviors as part of their diagnostic criteria, frequently the way that kids are expressing their symptoms happen with any medium, including screens. So in terms of the big picture, here is the issue with a lot of the stories that you see in media, in print, or on television. And that is that what those stories tend to take is very statistics that are either fear-mongering in the sense that they promote a certain fear-based perspective, or statistics that make you very concerned for our youth, things that are very disturbing mental health trends. And those disturbing mental health trends may very well be fact-based. At the same time, what we tend to then correlate them with are societal trends. So things like the rise of social media. And while they may be correlated, I think an important thing that scientists often distinguish is that even though things may be both going in the same direction, it doesn't necessarily mean one is causing the other. So, for example, what we see cited, and these first few slides are slides that we've actually created at the Child Mind Institute in conjunction with a partnership with Common Sense Media, just to try to make sure that we're creating some very simple, straightforward, upfront slides about how to kind of process screen-related information. So on the left side of this slide, what you can see are some overall statistics that are often cited, like the percentage of children who experience a mental disorder in any given year. We often say at the Child Mind Institute, it's 1 in 5 children before the age of 18 may be diagnosed with a mental health or learning disorder. There may be statistics about increases in depression, or research that's been cited a lot recently about increases in overall anxiety amongst the general population, not just children and adolescents, or the fact that suicide has been steadily on the rise over the last couple decades and is a major leading cause of death for adolescents and young adults. So we have those things. Those are absolutely problems to solve. Those are absolutely things we must pay attention to. They demand our attention because they literally are life or death, or they are quality of life issues. Now, in the same time, what we then link them to is some of the research, for example, that shows that kids who spend a large amount of their time on social media, so say 5+ hours on devices, may be more likely to have a mood disorder, or may be more likely to engage in self-harm or suicidal behavior. Then we also have results where when we look at studies of say, social media or of screens that show that actually screen-related behaviors explain very little of the mental health trends that we see, and that it's a statistical term called effect size, but basically that the kind of magnitude of the effect of screens may be smaller than we think compared to things that are just basic mental health practices. Like one of the oft said things about screens is that while screens may be having an effect on mental health, things like a healthy diet, eating breakfast, getting 8 hours of sleep a night, these kinds of basic wellness behaviors may explain so much more of a child or adolescent's mental health than whatever they're necessarily engaged in on screens. So because there are so many variables to consider and that the connections between these variables may be unclear in terms of their causal mechanism, we don't have a ton of clear answers. What we do have answers about is this. What we know about screens is that there is a definite link between kids who use a lot of their time, a lot of their free time spent on screen-related behaviors, and the child's mood or mental health. Now, that isn't to say that screens are inherently bad. It isn't to say that any time spent on screens is inherently injurious to mental health. And I'm going to talk a little bit later just about, some of the data around time and screens. In fact, I'll just kind of include an aside on that now. Not all screens are created equal. So watching television with your family may not be the same as, staying on social media for a couple hours alone in one's bedroom in adolescence. And so in that sense, we can't say that just time spent on screens is necessarily the only factor that we should consider. Clearly, what we're using and how we're using it is something that we should consider. And similarly with time, there's research suggesting that small amounts of time spent on screens for kids, adolescents, and adults may actually be mental health positive. It may be stress reducing, it may be relaxing, it may be a way of connecting more with family and friends. Whereas there may be this effect where, let's say if you're spending a little bit of time on screens, it's mental health positive. If you're spending a kind of medium amount of time, your free time on screens, maybe it's kind of a wash mental health wise. And if you're spending a lot of time on screens, the issue again isn't necessarily that the screens themselves are injurious. It may be that you're pushing out tasks that are really important for development that you otherwise need to be engaged in, or tasks that are really important for relationship maintenance. And I'll get to that a little bit later. What you're using screens for matters. So when we start to parse out the results related to screens, we start seeing is that if you use, for example, social media passively or only to get likes and follows, clearly the motivation behind that screen-related behavior may be because we're trying to fill some sort of gap in self-esteem, or we're trying to pass time because we're bored and we don't really have an active reason to use this. And that can cause us, when we eventually get off of those screens, to feel ashamed of our behavior or guilty, or to feel like the rest of life is maybe not as rewarding as our online behaviors and can promote more problematic behaviors. So we want to think about how much we're using, what we're using it for, the content that we're consuming. Another factor that's not on this slide that we need to think about, and what we know for sure, is that age matters. So in that sense, you're going to hear, as I start to go into the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations around screens a couple slides from now, it matters that we limit screen time, especially for very young children. Again, not because we're necessarily saying the screens themselves or the behaviors they're engaged in on screens are injurious, although there is some suggestion in certain studies that, for example, fast-paced programming, things like that for young kids may actually be harmful to attention. But it's more that, especially at young ages, children are in critical periods where there are certain developmental tasks that must occur. And if we don't actually make room for those tasks, if we have a kid who is on a screen for the time they should be spending on those tasks, that is even more injurious during critical periods of development, where it may not be as injurious, for example, for a teenager or young adult who perhaps has already accomplished those developmental tasks. So the last piece on this slide, other factors might matter more. Overall media balance with other life activities, sleep, general health, a number of friends, extracurricular engagement. These are factors that have been part of developmental research for decades, and screens are not necessarily unseating them in terms of their effect on child and adolescent mental health, and to be sure, their effect on adult mental health as well. So, understanding that there are a few kind of givens from screen time, this is a slide that we generally show parents and educators related to some of the research for the benefits of screen time and some of the research on the downsides of screen time. Now, what you'll notice is that benefits tend to be associated with moderate use of screens, again, balancing out other major life and wellness behaviors. Whereas a lot of the negatives of screens tend to be associated with either excessive use or inappropriate screen use, which we'll get to in a second. So in terms of some of the benefits, there is a body of research suggesting that certain screen-related behaviors, apps, tools online can have educational value. Not only for the fact that screens provide us with a more efficient information delivery system than anything that has existed thus far in human kind of evolution, but at the same time, there is some evidence that there are screen-related resources which are helpful for learning. Now, the issue with this educational kind of point is that there are more programs out there advertising their educational value screen-wise than have the evidence or the research to back it up. So parents have to be really informed consumers of what the results are associated with a certain program or resource and its educational value. We see these movements in education in various settings across the country in school districts where giving students iPads or giving students computers doesn't necessarily immediately close achievement gaps or further achievement. It actually is something that has to be very consciously planned proactively with resources that have a great evidence base. Now, next thing, screens give us a lot of tools for productivity, organization, and homework completion. There is evidence that schools that use kind of online ways of tracking homework assignments may improve communication with students and their ability to track homework, while at the same time increasing opportunities for distraction. For those of us who've seen students who utilize online programs in their school to track their homework assignments, what you can see is that while they may be checking their homework, they may also be going on YouTube. And that can be another tool for distraction that wasn't present generations ago when you would check your assignment book. whether you'd written it down or not. Screens can increase our ease of communication and our sense of social connection. There is lots of research suggesting that that is a positive effect of screen-related behavior. It can increase our sense of connection. And to be sure, not all social media or online communities are necessarily bad for adolescents, for example. Adolescents often find belonging in online communities where they feel understood and heard, and that are also promoting of health-related behaviors. And there are lots of examples of that. We collaborate, for example, with organizations like Bring Change to Mind or The Mighty or DoSomething.org, all of which are online communities focused on mental health and wellness, particularly for youth audiences. Screens can also be used for relaxation and stress relief. And as I said earlier, there is evidence from the research that small amounts of time spent on screens can contribute to these kinds of positive effects. Not to mention screens have immense entertainment value, of course. In terms of the downsides, I've already spoken a little bit about displacement of developmentally appropriate tasks, and what you'll see a little bit later in the presentation is that we actually, in the practical side, make a list for parents, in particular, of what those developmentally appropriate tasks should look like for children and adolescents, what boxes you need to check, because what parents will often do is they'll ask us the question, well, how should I place a limit on my child's screen time? And we often reformulate that question. We take that question and say, rather than think about the limits you're setting on screen time at first, let's think about the tasks you want to make sure there's room for in your child's life. And once you've checked all the boxes, let's see how much time is left over. And then that time can be assigned to screens and can be at least something that you place limits on. So we'll get to that in some of the practical slides. Poor school performance is definitely a downside of excessive and inappropriate screen use. Now, I will say that that is inextricably linked with sleep disruption, which is the third bullet point down here. It's that the major effect in the literature of screens is that for children, adolescents, and adults who use screens, we sleep less. This is partly because we don't obey rules for sleep hygiene that the best sleep researchers in the country and the world will tell us, as in, it does not matter if your screen has a night function. It is still a screen. It still keeps you awake and convinces your body that it may be daytime. It is best to stop using screens at least an hour before bedtime and do other activities. It is best to exist in an environment of dim light to convince your circadian rhythms that you need to be ready for sleep, and best to get rituals that you do before bedtime, not involving screens, that are going to help you to sleep. And the thing is, adolescents in particular, for whom the prefrontal area of the brain is still developing and for whom executive functioning and planning is still something that is definitely under construction, if we're talking about those functions, which involve prioritizing tasks, understanding the importance of long-term payoffs of what you're doing over and above the short-term payoff of something you might find rewarding in this moment, these are things adolescents are still working on. And what that means is that at that age, it can be really difficult to make the right decision about when to put that phone down and go to sleep and stop speaking to your friends. It can be really difficult to make the right decision about working on homework earlier on in the evening and not procrastinating when there's so many things to do on your screen, whether it's checking Instagram or playing Fortnite. And so the thing is, again, it may not be that Instagram or Fortnite are necessarily hurting your child. It's just that if they're spending all of their time on Instagram and Fortnite, pushing their homework further and further into the evening, then having to do that homework while also disrupting their sleep, and then needing a screen to cope with the stress of their homework after they've finished what was already delayed, we've got some negative effects. We also see with screens, look, in terms of content, there is some research linking, for example, the content that kids are exposed to earlier initiation of, say, risky behaviors, or in particular with violent video games or violent content. It's not necessarily been shown or suggested in literature that if you are not violent to begin with or not aggressive, that violent video games will make you violent, but more that if you already are prone to aggression or anger, this kind of content can actually exacerbate that particular issue. Cyberbullying is another downside to excessive screen use. The more time you spend online, the more likely you are to be exposed to cyberbullying. Now, it is not necessarily true that bullying occurs more often online than it does offline, but it lives forever, and it also can have a much more public effect. And so there's definitely kind of considerations that need to be made for the presence of screens, in the sense that we often say in bullying talks today that kids used to be able to go home from school and know that unless the bullies that they had at school were getting together with their friends outside of school, it was unlikely that that bullying was to continue offline or after school hours. Whereas today, you can take a conversation that's happening at the end of school and move it online and have it happen the entire evening. which immediately increases sort of the potency and the injury that can result from some of these behaviors. So that's another thing that we're often trying to make sure that parents are informed about and can help and make sure that their kids are supported and know that they have someone to go to speak about this. Now, I will say there's mixed research related to the effect of screens on sedentary behavior and obesity and kind of, lack of physical activity. There has been research looking at whether or not, having kids exercise a certain amount of time per day or trying to decrease the amount of time that a kid spends sitting or on screens during the day could contribute to kind of lowered obesity. So in that sense, there's research trying to link physical activity, overall physical health and diet, and screens. And the difficulty is the results are mixed about how much of a connection there is between screens and kids and adolescents and their weight. But at the same time, it is still a caution. It's still something to think about. It's still something to think about in terms of its balance with physical activity and health-related behaviors. Another major thing that we help parents and educators and kids and adolescents think about related to screens is the fact that behaviors that you engage in online live forever and may not be private. They may be quickly, screenshotted, forwarded around, things like that. And that can have an exacerbating effect on kids, particularly those who are already prone to mental health and learning disorders, when they already feel vulnerable or when already their self-esteem is at risk. That kind of permanence can be unhealthy in terms of something that can keep coming up over and over in terms of a cyberbullying issue. What I will also get back to is that there is research suggesting that use of screens can result in a bidirectional worsening of mental health symptoms. So what I mean is, if a child is prone to, say, depression or anxiety, it's not necessarily the research clearly says these screen-related behaviors cause depression. It's more that if they're already prone to something, continued engagement in certain screen-related behaviors may worsen those symptoms in ways that the symptoms wouldn't get worse without those behaviors. So it might be that if you're already feeling badly about yourself and you post pictures of yourself to social media and then receive criticism, your depression might get worse. Or if you're already anxious and feel the need to check things over and over and over, and one of the things you're anxious about is, say, for example, the safety of your parents, having access to text messaging may cause you to engage in even more text messaging to check on the safety or whereabouts of a person you're worried about. So this is the slide I was going to talk about related to the American Academy of Pediatrics. So these are recommendations that the American Academy of Pediatrics have made related to what is healthy in terms of screen time. So less than 18 months, as I already said, use of screens is generally discouraged, other than video chatting. And in this sense, within the field, we think of this as sort of the American Academy of Pediatrics being honest about what parents are likely engaging in. I myself have a 2.5-year-old, and I can tell you that video chatting, at young ages or younger than 18 months, it may not be necessarily that the child can engage too much in video chatting, but lots of people do it because it's one of the most wonderful ways to get relatives at a distance, to have exposure to a new baby in the family. But in general, the reason why it's discouraged, there's so much critically that's happening with fine motor and gross motor development, speech developments, and expressive and receptive language during that time, that there really is no value in replacing the time that needs to be spent listening to words and moving around the world and getting sensory input with, say, screens. From 18 to 24 months, I think what we're thinking about in this age range is, as kids get closer and closer to 2, there are programs both that are marketed for kids with sort of quality lessons and morals they might be trying to communicate. And at the same time, we might be being honest with ourselves that at times parents may use the screens as a break, or kids may be exposed to them at friends' houses or at school and then request that kind of time at home. So as screens start to become a part of life, what the American Academy of Pediatrics suggests is that you choose what they're defining as high-quality programming, which has guidelines around it. You can find certain things like that on websites like Common Sense Media. But at the same time, what they're also recommending is mediated viewing or co-viewing. So this is something that's not just for toddlers. It's for kids and adolescents across the age spectrum. It's that when you view television programs or when you view YouTube videos or things on screens with your children, you provide an opportunity for discussion. Even if that opportunity for discussion is just the comments that you both make about the characters on screen, you also provide an opportunity for real-world generalization. So the reason why you sit with your kids while they're watching these things on screens is A, it increases the chance that they will talk to you about what they're involved in life in the future, but B, it also lets you perhaps think about the themes that they're seeing and draw their attention to ones that you'd like to see, move into real life, and perhaps, maybe correct things that you worry about in terms of messages they might receive. From 2 to 5 years, the recommendation is to set media limits not exceeding an hour per day, and again, to still utilize that media with your young child. 6+. This is where it gets to be something where with each family, there are individual plans we set up from 6 through age 18. But the general guidelines are to place consistent limits, watch for media taking place of other behaviors essential to health, like I've already referred to, and to continue to have ongoing discussions about screen behavior, and to designate media free time. So to know when you're all taking a break from media and screen time. Now, on the point of that ongoing discussion, one of the things we'll often say to parents is that even though it's become now commonplace for students to have health discussions within school and to perhaps get discussions about drugs and alcohol or discussions about sexual behavior that happen in the classroom, from elementary on through high school years, it is very rare that people are given an owner's manual for how to behave online. And in that sense, we have to think about that. It's not just innate. The moment that you're handed a screen, you don't just learn necessarily what behaviors are appropriate online, what your voice sounds like over email, what you should post on Instagram, how you should behave when you're kind of chatting with someone while playing a video game. All of these behaviors, while they might seem like some of them could be intuitive, from the mapping on of other social behaviors you'd use in real life, there's still a lot to learn about the online world. So that's why we tell parents that the object for parents and educators to seek out resources that can provide you with a curricula and talking points related to screens to help kids to understand what behaviors might be appropriate as they move online. And then the other thing is, as kids start to use screens, oftentimes in late elementary school, they might start to use screens a little bit more independently. And by middle school, they're asking for their own phone, or they're asking for the opportunity to use screens by themselves. These are the moments to become your child's digital neighbor, to be as close as you can in monitoring what they're doing online, in reinforcing the behaviors that you like seeing, and also in placing limits on the ones you don't. And if you haven't done this when they're of younger ages and now they're in high school, there are still ways to figure out how you can be their digital neighbor. But what that entails is a lot of times parents censoring themselves, trying to observe what the child is doing online without commenting a lot, such that the child can start to believe they understand their world. And then parents really have to choose their battles and choose what they're really going to go after in terms of their teens' online behavior. Now, going to the next slide. Now I'm going to zero in on screen use and ADHD. So the next couple slides are research related to ADHD specific effects. So first, the research is mixed related to how much screens play a causal role in exacerbating ADHD symptoms, rather than being just an avenue for expression in the sense that you already have ADHD and just the symptoms that already would be, for example, evident for a kid with hyperactive impulsive symptoms when they're in a restaurant and they can't sit down. Maybe those symptoms are also expressed in their impulsivity online. The fact that they're about to say something that they might not, be supposed to say, or that might be inappropriate, or that they might, quit something right before they actually achieve something in a game, or they might get overly angry at the, and reactive in certain situations when they can't find the reward they're looking for too quickly. So again, what we're looking at is the idea that we want to be cautious in making statements about screen use and ADHD. There is evidence for a correlation between media use and the severity of ADHD symptoms. So in that sense, screens may not cause ADHD, but they may have some role depending on how limits are placed on them and how a child or teenager is using them in exacerbating the way that ADHD symptoms are expressed. When we do large analyses, really looking at the connections between screens and ADHD, as I referenced before, this statistical term effect size, the effect sizes still tend to be fairly small. especially compared to other major behaviors related to health and mental wellness, like sleep or like healthy diet, or having a supportive adult, or being able to have a sense that you're succeeding academically. Again, those things developmentally always tend to be the most powerful factors, where screens have a smaller effect. Now, studies have investigated, related to kind of ADHD, overall time spent on screens, the effect of violent video games, how programs are paced, whether or not there are differential effects for males and females, and whether or not certain parenting factors, contribute to this exacerbation. And the reality is that the results tend to be mixed on most of these factors, according to recent meta-analyses. It's that it isn't necessarily that spending a ton of time on screens always exacerbates ADHD symptoms. It isn't necessarily that violent video games necessarily exacerbate ADHD symptoms. While there is some evidence that fast-paced programs may decrease someone's overall capacity for focus or for delay of gratification, there's also other research studies that suggest that that effect is not necessarily that powerful. And while there is evidence suggesting that the effects of screens may be more pronounced for males, there's also studies suggesting it the opposite way around. In terms of age, always, with younger kids, we need to be more cautious. That is something that isn't necessarily as mixed, but that as we get older, the results may be mixed in terms of the effects of screens on ADHD symptoms. I'm going to talk about parenting factors a little bit more in a minute. But going on to kind of what we see in practice with ADHD, what we see is the intersection of these biologically based ADHD symptoms. And make no mistake, ADHD is one of the most biologically based mental health disorders. It's something that we expect for many of the cases that we see to be genetic and to be existing from a very early age. So what that means is that from a very early age, someone may be experiencing symptoms like a difficulty focusing in line with their same-aged peers, difficulty with distractibility, difficulty with follow-through on certain tasks, difficulty organizing themselves, difficulty with impulsiveness, difficulty with, calling out in classroom situations or in places where it might not be appropriate. They might be too loud or, interrupting people. And those symptoms can express themselves anywhere that they have a medium for expression. So in that sense, executive functioning difficulties are highly correlated with ADHD. They're not necessarily symptoms of ADHD, but they're very highly correlated. This is all Russell Barkley's research. So what that means is that if you're using screens, we tend to see ADHD symptoms have the largest effect when kids are doing things that are not novel, that are not exciting, that are repetitive, or that are boring. So what tends to happen is where somebody else might have the executive functioning skills to say, look, even though this task is boring, even though I don't want to do it, I still need to focus. I still need to do this task and get it done. Someone with ADHD may have much more difficulty doing that. And that's coming from a biological place. It's not because they're not trying hard. It's literally the areas of the brain that govern that may not necessarily be functioning in a way that supports the kind of executive functioning someone else may be capable of. So in that sense, if you have a choice between a screen, something that is novel and something that you're excited about and something that you find to be interesting, and you have a choice between, say, a homework assignment or answering emails for work or doing some laundry, it can be very difficult to effectively prioritize that, and you may have a lot of lost time on screens. And we need to help children, adolescents, and adults with executive functioning difficulties or difficulties with ADHD to kind of set themselves up for success, to make it so that the screens aren't accessible at the times when they could procrastinate on those more boring tasks, and to make it so that instead we're utilizing the screens as a reward in small doses, perhaps, for getting the executive functioning tasks that we find to be more boring but of higher priority done. Similarly, what we know from research on ADHD is that kids and adolescents with ADHD tend to seek out rewards, may have a definite lower sense of self-control or ability to self-regulate. And so in that sense, because screens possess so many opportunities for reward, whereas other behaviors in life may not be so potent in terms of the immediate reward you might get out of them, it takes a lot of structure to take something so rewarding, place limits on it, and then make it so that someone has the ability to engage in other rewarding tasks and can habitually engage in it enough so that that now becomes a practiced behavior, kind of as an alternative to screen-related behaviors. That can take a lot with someone with ADHD. Another major factor we think about with screen use and ADHD is that if you have a biologically based cluster of symptoms that makes it difficult for you to focus, difficult for you to follow through, difficult for you to listen to directions, difficult for it to feel like you're being appropriate in certain conversations, and you get from an early age negative messages from your family, from your friends, or from your teachers about how much you just need to try and control those things, it is no wonder that many people with ADHD then retreat into screen-related behaviors or screen-related kind of enclaves in order to find solace, in order to find communities that they enjoy, people who share their interests. And that can be something where if all the negative feedback is happening in real life and all the positive feedback is happening on screens, that can be a real kind of incentive in pushing someone toward a larger amount of time spent on screens. It's one of the reasons why behavioral interventions for ADHD tend to focus on decreasing the amount of negative feedback in the environment, on trying to make sure that we set clear expectations and that we provide positive feedback related to someone's effort in shaping any, small step toward a positive behavior, and where we try to decrease the kind of threat of consequences and punishment, except in situations where we really need them. And again, ADHD, when screens might be right in front of you, this might mean that you spend more time on screens and less time, say, with friends or sleeping or engaging in things that are a bit more boring. So, a couple last things on ADHD. In terms of common pitfalls for parents, one of the things that we hear about related to ADHD and screens is that parents will tell us, well, my teen says that they can have YouTube open playing something and be doing their homework and also have a chat window open with their parents. And, the sense is that and this goes to the second bullet point, parents don't want them to miss out. They don't want them to lose their connection to their peers or lose their connection to their friends, or everyone else may be able to continue working on a group project while the kid is on a sort of group chat function. The reality is that what we know from the research that multitasking is a myth. We do not multitask. We just do multiple tasks worse than we would if we were doing one task alone. So in that sense, there is, for example, some encouraging research that suggests in some ways that maybe kids with ADHD may be able to focus better with music than without, for example. And there's all kinds of theories about exactly why that might be. But what we tell parents is, even if you're looking at mixed results on whether or not a kid could have a stimulus in their environment while they're working on homework, like music, which is more passive versus, say, having all your friends on a group chat, the real thing we want parents to think about is to take a data-driven approach. If a child says, I work better on the couch than I do at my desk, or I work better with music than without, or I work better when my buddy, Brian is on my group chat and I can actually speak to him about how we're working on homework, our answer is to throw down a data-driven test. Let's take a baseline on how well you're working on your homework, how much time it takes, and how efficient you are at finishing it with this thing. Then let's remove it and see how efficient you might be. Then let's put it back in place. And what we try to think about is, as that factor is removed or added, does the teen show us that they're better on homework? Now, this is not entirely scientific because the teen may be very motivated to show you that they're better on homework when you introduce a factor like music or the fact that Brian's on the group chat. But the thing is, whether they're motivated to do better because they have that reinforcing factor or they actually are focusing better, if the product is better, that's what we ask parents to look at, not necessarily the process. So last thing I'll say is that screens in school settings may not necessarily be beneficial for kids with ADHD. And there's kind of a lot of mixed use in that, in the sense that, like, if a kid is given a computer in class, there are a number of safeguards we need to put on related to distraction in order to make sure the work being done on that computer is relevant. Now, I'm going to get into a few practical strategies for about 10 minutes, and then I will pause for questions. So here are a couple slides on the practical strategies. So we've talked about what we know of the research on screens. Then we've talked about what we know of some of the more specific effects related to screen use and ADHD. And now we get into what's practical, because what you've likely heard from my talk is that while it's right that we should consider the research, be cautious about certain factors related to screens, and be cautious in thinking about causality as opposed to just sort of correlation. What it comes down to is what works for your family. And that's what people really get down to with us, is whether or not we agree with them or not in their perspective on screens, what do they do? So this is what I was referencing earlier. It's that when parents come in and they say to us, how do I place limits on screens, particularly for my child with ADHD? What we say is, let's put the limits aside for a second and start with how you're going to make your family media plan. Let's check off these developmentally important boxes. So first, what are we doing about basic wellness behaviors? How often is your child exercising? Are they part of a sport that's organized? Or have they found another outlet for exercise? Or do they exercise with their sister? Or is it something else? We know that they need to be able to do that for their mental health, and that's really important over and above whatever they might be doing on screens. How are they sleeping? We ask parents for the data on what time their child goes to sleep, how many hours they're getting, whether or not that's appropriate for their developmental stage, and what time they're waking up. We ask about their diet. And again, diet, physical activity, and sleep, they are not a treatment for any mental health disorder, but they are basic wellness behaviors that improve everyone's mental health. So we want to make sure that those things are there as a foundation. The next thing we ask about is family relationship quality. So we say, how often does your child spend time with one of their parents in any activity that you both mutually enjoy? How often do you have a meal in which family members are looking at each other? This is one of the major things, is that when we look at research, for example, on prevention of substance abuse later on, family dinner a couple times a week can be a major protective factor. Now, the interesting thing about that we often tell parents is that the family dinner doesn't necessarily have to be that all of you are sitting around a dinner table telling each other how much you love each other, engaging in good manners, and making sure that everyone, puts their dishes in the sink at the end. It's literally just family dinner. You are eating dinner in the same place and, eating a meal together. But we try to take inventory of how much time the family spends together and then what the relationship quality might be, because those are major things that are protective, especially as you move into adolescence. Having a supportive parent who you feel like, even if, for example, you got yourself into a risky situation, you could come to, and though there might still be a punishment for those behaviors, this is somebody who's going to help you get out of jams and help you think through things. That's an important thing, and it's a very hard needle for parents to thread. That needle of, I don't want you to do things that are risky, but at the same time, if you get yourself into trouble, I'm here and I'll help you get out of it, even if there will be consequences. The next thing that we try to talk to parents about is school attendance and performance. We want to make sure that screens are not in any way inhibiting, for example, a child's on-time arrival to school, whether or not they're, staying at school at the right times, or staying for, if they have an opportunity, for example, to go to tutoring after school, are they staying for that, or are they running home to engage in kind of other behaviors? And similarly, what their academic performance looks like, because what we know is that, even having a child who is, doing okay academically is very, very protective later on for the kinds of risky behaviors that teens can get into. So next, we talk about homework and study time. We ask how structured it is, how we put limits on other distractors that might happen, what a child's work area looks like while they're doing homework, and how we kind of make boundaries around that study time at home. And we definitely encourage parents from early ages to eliminate screens from that environment. Another family member should not be watching TV at the same time that a kid is working on homework at the kitchen table. And similarly, when kids start to get phones, having a phone present while they're doing homework is not necessarily needed. And even as kids tell us, oh, I need this for my homework, or I must, utilize this for my homework, that's something where when they say they need to use a computer, we try to make sure that kids are making the decision only when they need to use the computer and not when they just want to go and check YouTube. Or if they do want to check YouTube as a break, we structure that. Again, we have parents check the box for extracurricular activities. Does the child have meaningful things that they're engaged in? And those things can be screen related, like maybe the kid is engaged in a robotics or a coding class. But either way, it's something they attend in real life with other people that allows them some connection to others, some opportunities for face-to-face interaction, and some opportunities to cultivate interests that are not online based. And finally, we ask parents to take inventory of a child's social life. Do they have one or two close friends? Do they have acquaintances at school? Do they generally seem like, they get along well with other kids? Do they see some family members or other kids in the family from time to time? Do they attend, birthday parties? As they get older, are their friends going out in groups? Do they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend? These are all major developmental tasks in social relationships that are going to be important for us as we get older. We want to make sure to make room for those things, outside of screen-related behavior. So once we've asked parents those questions and we've checked off those boxes, if we've got the kind of structure we need to make room for all of those things, what we know is that aligned with the kind of theory-related, screen-related behaviors of displacement, along the lines that we're not displacing other developmentally important tasks, now we get down to how we set up our screen plan. So for the time that we are, spending on screens, here's what we try to talk to parents about. First, what are your non-negotiables? For some parents, for example, of middle school kids, it's no selfies. For other parents, it's no use of swear words or insults on group chats. We want parents to make sure they know exactly what their rules are, and that not only those rules framed in terms of behaviors they don't want, but also behaviors they do want. I want you to speak appropriately as if your grandmother was watching each group chat. I want you to make sure that any photo you posted is something that we would approve of and say that is a nice picture of your friends or a nice picture of scenery or a nice picture of some art you've created. And so in that sense, we want families to frame for kids what their online behaviors are that they feel like would result, for example, if the child was to engage in it, in the removal of screens or the removal of that privilege. Because screens are not a human right. We often tell parents, your job is to provide your child with shelter, with food, with care and love, with a place to sleep, but you do not need to provide them with a screen of any kind for them to live. Then we define the structured parts of the family schedule. Aligned with the American Academy of Pediatrics, we want to figure out, now that we've got these parts of our families, now that we've got these media-free times, for example, a family dinner or a time on the weekend when screens are not meant to be used, we want to define what those structured pieces look like when we're all not using screens. We emphasize that a lot, that parents should not use screens in those media-free times. It's not necessarily that we're trying to downplay the importance of your work or of the communication you have with other family and friends. It's that if you don't model the behaviors you'd like to see for your child, they are unlikely to engage with them. Now, I've already spoken about the point of not all screen time being created equal, but another point that we talk about with family media plans is public versus private spaces. It is best, especially at young ages, to set a boundary for kids that their screen time happens in public. Even if they're looking at an iPad with headphones, having that screen be kind of consumed in public makes for some measure of accountability and makes it more likely that a parent or other family member could be walking by at some point, and that taking a screen into a private space entails a measure of trust. Now, we do not necessarily recommend that anyone allow their teen to keep their phone in their room overnight. You don't have to. Because what we know is that, many teens, especially teens with ADHD, may have difficulty, stopping themselves from using their phone, or if they wake up in the night, not starting to kind of engage in screen-related behaviors. But it's more that if a phone is taken into a private space, or if an iPad is taken into a private space, we understand that that may be a preferred method of consumption, but there's some trust there. And we want to outline clearly what the criteria are for us to be able to trust, for example, a teen in their private space use of screens. That gets to also setting clear behavior expectations. I've already kind of referenced the point on modeling and the fact that if you have small children, one of the best things you can do is have a conversation. If you have a partner, have a conversation with them about what screen-related behaviors you want to see later on. Then the best task to do beyond that is to reflect either for yourself or with your partner on how you can start modeling those behaviors from an early age to show your child that you behave the same way you expect them to behave online and in terms of your relationship with your screen. I focus on this every day, and the fact that I tell myself I've got lots of important emails I'm supposed to check. But the bottom line is, if my child is looking at me and trying to spend quality time with me, and I want them later on when they're a teenager not to think it's appropriate to look at their phone at the dinner table, my phone's got to be somewhere else. And that is really tough to do. The other thing that we always talk to parents about in terms of scaffolding screen-related behavior is that it is very important to know your expectation, then to know what that expectation looks like in its infancy stage, and then to shape that expectation over time. So, for example, many parents may say to their child, I really want you to only have appropriate language in group chats. But what needs to happen is that at an early age, it's best to monitor the group chats at some level and tell the child, I'm going to check in on what you're saying to your friends. And then to really highlight any of the child's efforts to demonstrate the behavior that you're asking them for and saying, that was a really appropriate way that you didn't take the bait in that group chat. I really liked how you made this comment that was much more positive than some of your friends were being in this group chat. And that kind of feedback is a way of shaping those behaviors over time to ensure that your child has that kind of citizenship online. So I'm going to pause there And now what I'm hoping is that Wayne might have some questions to feed me related to, family media plans, ADHD, or screen-related behaviors.
Yes, loads of questions.
Go for it, Wayne.
Is there something in the way the ADHD brain, I hope you didn't mention this, there was a lot of information, the way the ADHD brain is wired that causes a natural attraction to screens?
Right. So there are a lot of suggestions, particularly in media stories, related to how brains are wired and, how screens are so rewarding. So the most common theme is this idea that because kids with ADHD are more prone to reward-seeking behavior, that what people will emphasize is this idea that brain structures associated with reward, or in its worst form, brain structures associated with drug use, are activated when kids engage in screen-related behaviors. The reality is that the same brain structures that are related to rewards are activated when you're having ice cream, as when you're having screens, as when you might be engaged in more risky and rewarding behaviors. So it's not so much about brain activation that we're necessarily worried about. Mm-hmm. It's more that because we know that ADHD has as part of its symptomatology that you are more reward-seeking and less likely to engage in boring, repetitive, or needed tasks like washing clothes or doing the grocery shopping or finishing a boring homework assignment than you are to be on a screen. That's as close as we get to saying that a kid with ADHD might be wired to be attracted to screens. But I worry about narratives that get more negative than that. What's the next one, Wayne?
Do you find that a child on medication displays less of the screen behaviors?
So the question was about whether or not a child on medication displays less of screen-related behaviors. And the thing is, medication for ADHD is oftentimes stimulant medication meant to help kids with prefrontal functions or executive functions. It's meant to help kids in the way that it works in the brain to be able to prioritize, to be able to plan better, and to be able to perhaps impede impulses that might otherwise be associated with ADHD. So what you'd expect is that if medication is effective for ADHD symptoms, it also might be effective in helping to promote the child's self-control around screens. But again, it's not necessarily that the medicine is having an effect on screens. The medicine is having an effect on ADHD behaviors, and then those ADHD behaviors were formerly expressed through screens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lots of questions about very violent behaviors and screaming and profanities when a parent tries to get a child off his Fortnite, let's say. And they're very worried. First of all, they wondered if the video game itself is making them more violent.
Right. So we've got questions about violent behaviors and video games, and a lot of parents asking about the kind of really emotionally dysregulated reactions that kids will have when parents are trying to pull them off screens. So look, I want to separate those two things. First was I did make a reference earlier on the fact that the literature on violent video games is somewhat mixed, but in general, if there's a cautionary talking point to be taken from it, it is that it is not necessarily suggested that violent video games make kids who are not already prone to aggression or violence violent, but that for kids who are already prone to emotional dysregulation, aggression, or violence, violent video games can have an exacerbating or accelerating effect. So in that sense, it matters what the content is of the video games, but it can be hard because for a lot of parents, they've only realized this after they've already bought the video games. And to be sure, what parents are describing when they pull their kids off screens and they see these kind of violent or emotionally dysregulated reactions is they're seeing what we call the coercive cycle. It's this idea that when a child is pulled away from a preferred behavior, what they do is they make it really hard on the people in the environment. And they may not be doing this out of manipulative or conscious intent. It's just kind of how humans are wired. It's that you scream and you yell and you try to cajole and you try to persuade and you try to let that parent know, look, I still need, more of this time. You've got to let me do this. You ended my game too early. A lot of what parents also don't understand is that sometimes their kids' screen-related behaviors do actually have time, in them, in the sense that like a Fortnite game does end eventually. But if you pull a kid away in the middle, it can be much more jarring than if you pull away at the end. But lots of parents will come back to us and say, look, I tell my kid that, but then they just restart a game whenever I'm not in the room. Mm-hmm. The bottom line is that we try to figure out with parents is if they have difficulty getting their child off of a game, we go through a quick hierarchy, and I'll show you that hierarchy here because it was something that I was going to go into if I had time. But, you know, in any talk like this, there's always so much to discuss. But it's that if you're going through a hierarchy of behavioral techniques, the behavior you want is that the child comes off of screens calmly. It's that when you give them the privilege of engaging in screen-related behaviors, they end it calmly within range of the appropriate amount of time you thought that they were going to spend. So your next step is when you give them that screen time, you make it contingent on whether or not they come off of it calmly. So in the moment when you're taking away their screen the night before and you're telling them they have to stop playing Fortnite, their screen time the next night, whether or not they're going to be able to find their phone or whether or not they're going to be able to play with a certain video game controller or something like that, is contingent on how calm they are in coming off of the screen on the previous night. And when we try to help parents to set up are those kinds of contingencies, where rather than feeling like what they really want to do is throw the Xbox out the window or throw the phone out the window in the midst of this event, it's more that we set the child up for success by saying, look, here's how you earn your screen time, by showing me the behavior that I would like. And then the next thing that we go to is thinking about how we can ignore certain behaviors that might happen related to screens. So if the child's not throwing a huge tantrum, but they're speaking in kind of a mildly disrespectful tone when the screen is taken away, like instead of them screaming, they're saying, oh, I can't believe this. I was so close. I can't believe you took this away. Like, you're so mean, or something like that, which is kind of common child disrespect. We try to withdraw attention from that. We don't actually want to get into the coercive cycle too much or start to engage the child, because what that says is, listen, if you are mad because I took away the tangible reinforcement of your screen, here's a full dose of my attention just to let you know that you can get some power and control and reward from acting like, you know, a very difficult person in the wake of, you know, having the screen taken away. And then finally, if a parent is really having difficulty with this, where the child really is losing it as they're coming off screens, we try to help them to think about both screen and non-screen based consequences, where we take inventory of the various privileges that are there in a child's life. And we try to say to a parent, don't have all or none punishments that are too distant. Like, you don't take away their Ariana Grande ticket 6 months from now. I mean, you might, but it's not necessarily an effective punishment. You try to figure out, what is it that you have at your disposal that's more immediate that you might be able to take away in increments, like a certain number of dollars of allowance or a certain number of minutes of screen time, in the event that someone displays a reaction that is really difficult. Now, I will say the approach that I'm talking about right now, I went through a lot just now. It is common to almost any form of behavioral parent training. And I will say that on Attitude's website, on Child Mind Institute's website, childmind.org, on understood.org, there are lots of websites that provide these kinds of pointers for parents. And in the event that you really need kind of in this case, it may not be screens, but it may be help with managing behavior. There are also certain books we recommend, and I do not gain any sort of financial benefit from these books, but the books that we recommend related to behavior are Alan Kasdan, for example, has a book called The Everyday Parenting Toolkit that outlines a lot of these approaches and how parents can apply them both for screen-related behaviors and non-screen-related behaviors alike. And again, that's Alan Kasdan's book, The Everyday Parenting Toolkit. Wayne, let's hit one more question.
Yeah. Are there any certain types of video games that are more rewarding than others?
So Wayne was asking, are there any certain types of video games that are more rewarding than others? I'm not sure what the context is for the word rewarding. I think that video games and many kind of apps online, to a behaviorist, they're very well constructed. They often have fixed reinforcers, meaning every time you sign in or every time you do a task in the game, you get a certain reward. They often have variable schedule reinforcers, meaning that every time you perform or that at unpredictable intervals, you may get rewarded for certain behaviors that you've engaged in, and you may kind of level up or get kind of rewards of coins or new and special items, things like that. And then they have opportunities for you to actually spend your money to then get even more rewarding stages. Plus, lots of apps are constructed so that you never die and you never get punished. If you do run out of, for example, chances to play or something like that, you can always buy more if you're willing to invest more money in the app. So these things are set up behaviorally. And video game companies and app companies will tell you that they're set up for convenience. They're set up to allow the user to have the most enjoyable experience. that is also a sort of code for they're set up to be as behaviorally rewarding as possible. Mm-hmm. So the issue is that we have to be mindful of that. We have to know that these games are constructed that way and to try to tell ourselves, look, I'm going to make an agreement that I'm only going to play this many games or I'm going to stop at this time. Because to be sure, the way that they're constructed, they are meant to keep us in them for as long as we might like to play and enjoy them. And unfortunately, that can be to the detriment of a lot of other tasks we've got to accomplish.
Right.
Wait, one more. I think we got 1 minute.
Well, I think we might have to end it there.
Okay, got it.
But that was absolutely fantastic. Really very good. I thanks so much for being here and sharing your expertise.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad that I got a chance to speak with you all. It looked like we had a good 1,700 person observed discussion here, and that's a fantastic audience to get some of these discussions started with.
Yeah. Thanks again so much.
Thank you.
Once again, I just want to, today's sponsor of the webinar is Play Attention, which enhances brain health and performance. Play Attention is the leading neurocognitive training program designed to strengthen executive function and self-regulation. The comprehensive Play Attention system includes NASA-inspired technology, cognitive training, behavior shaping, parent coaching, and much more. Call 800-788-6786 for their free ebooks on mindfulness, executive function, and more, or go to their website, www.playattention.com. Next week on May 14th, Ari Tuckman will be talking about adult ADD, what to do after the diagnosis, achieving acceptance, best treatment options, and how to make progress. It should be a very good one. So see you then, and have a great day, everyone.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.